This morning, Congressman Michael Waltz is here to talk about the federal response and the potential congressional aid package for victims. As a lifelong Floridian, as someone who has been through a number of storms, tell me your initial thoughts on Hurricane Ian and the damage it caused across a large portion of this state.
Well, the damage in Southwest Florida is horrific and obviously very visually obvious. What I think we're still kind of wrapping our minds around, so to speak, is the damage across the rest of the state in central and northeast Florida. I could tell you in my district along Florida's east coast, it really was a 1-2-3 punch. The storm was moving so slowly and dumping so much water on top of the water it was pushing into our rivers. And then when that wind swung off the east coast, it looped around like a big right hook and caused its own storm surge. So, we're seeing areas that are still being flooded. The water is still rising in the St. Johns River because all of that water has to go somewhere, and it's going to creeks, tributaries, lakes, and then moving like a big bubble down the river. So there's some areas that are still, the water is actually still coming up into their homes, so many days after the storm. And even though they weren't, completely blown over, if you've got 6 inches of water sitting in between the mold and the damage and sewage that's being backed up, it's still very, very destructive, and this is going to be a long recovery.
And 6 inches would probably be on the lighter side for a lot of folks, as we've seen water levels up to windows,
right,
preventing people from opening their doors. So the water rescues have been happening even after the storm has passed. But I want to ask you about the response from the federal level. As you mentioned, so much of the focus, and rightly so, has been on Southwest Florida as they work to completely rebuild so much of that infrastructure, the bridges, and so many homes that have been leveled, the power grid, another thing.
Right.
What about Central Florida? Because as you pointed out, so many homes here have been destroyed, but in a different way with this storm.
Yeah.
So as the federal response plays out and money is being diverted to the state of Florida, how will you ensure that a large pocket of that money goes to folks in Central Florida?
Sure. Well, obviously in the near term, we're still in search and rescue mode and recovery mode. The National Guard, our first responders, the Coast Guard providing life-saving food, water, ice, and materials. But to your point, the early FEMA designations, which we pushed for from my office and across the congressional delegation, was critical. That allows our local county officials to do the debris cleanup, to provide that early individual assistance, which can be up to $38,000. Eventually, I do believe we will get certain types of property designations as well, which will allow a different type of assistance. And tomorrow I'm going to visit in Daytona a center where the Small Business Administration, FEMA, other types of county and state officials will all be in one place with all of the experts to talk to people about what they qualify for and the process to begin as soon as possible applying for that assistance. That's why those FEMA designations for individual assistance were so important.
This storm did not make landfall, obviously, on the Atlantic coast, and yet we saw the Sunglow Pier, we saw the Flagler County Pier, Flagler Beach Pier get damaged. And so it's just, I'm just curious how this storm compares, and if it's, I know that we don't like to compare storms because every single one is unique, but the billions of dollars in damage and the loss of life for this storm, this is a storm that we'll be talking about for decades and decades to come.
No, I do think the damage estimates when they all come in are going to be historic compared to other storms like Matthew and Irma. But right now we're focused on saving as many lives as possible. Property and other things can be rebuilt, but the loss incurred from people and family members losing their lives in this storm, obviously never can be. So we will do what needs to be done to get that eventual recovery in place. But it's important to point out it's not just FEMA. It's the Department of Agriculture for our farmers and our crop damages. It's the Department of Transportation for our infrastructure. It's the Corps of Engineers to rebuild and evaluate those seawalls and whether bridges are still worthy and sustained permanent damage. And of course, the Small Business Administration for our small business owners that may have been flooded out or permanently impaired. So it really is a whole of government effort. It will take sustained engagement from our congressional delegation, from our senators. I hope that we can have a clean, relatively clean supplemental appropriation before the end of this year, if not early next year, to make sure those funds are flowing.
You know, I know that it's easy to, in this day and age, to make things political, and I'm going to do my best not to, because
thank you.
It's not the time, it's not the place, but yet there are headlines, and naturally so. And I think I want to clear up some of those headlines and let you say your piece on
Sure.
it. All 16 GOP House members, including you, voted against a bill that would free up billions of dollars in disaster relief funding. Now, about 15 million estimated would be going to Hurricane Ian and developing that. Why vote against that? Can you clear that up for us?
Yeah, so this was a continuing resolution, which is basically a stopgap measure. It was developed before Hurricane Ian even existed. I have taken principled votes against these measures my entire time in Congress. The Democrats have not passed a budget. They have not passed a full year appropriation. And what these stopgap measures do is actually hurt our military. It actually is damaging to our National Guard, to our Coast Guard, and others that are out there, because it doesn't give them a full year budget. It actually doesn't allow them to build anything new, no new helicopters or planes or ships. So I've consistently taken that approach. In terms of the FEMA Disaster Relief Fund, there were still $10 billion in that fund that would have not been affected. So that really explains the vote, and that's why I think you've seen people take that stance across the board. We will get a supplemental appropriation focused on Hurricane Ian and the damage estimates that come in. What I hope does not happen is that provide an opportunity for others to load in their other non-storm related priorities. And we see that a lot, and that's politics at its worst. What we hope doesn't happen, and this is kind of getting into the legislative sausage making, is the majority, the Democrat majority, will know that there's something out there that we oppose. Then they'll add this aid onto that and try to put us in a pickle, right? Of either because we oppose some other measure, having to vote against it, or having to go for it, and then taking those kind of political hits. Again, it's not the time for politics. And along those lines, there have been other things in headlines that Governor DeSantis hasn't been strong on climate change, and it's almost this narrative of he got what he deserved, and that's just wrong on so many levels. It's wrong morally, but it's wrong on the substance. He actually appointed the state's first chief resiliency officer. I think one of the reasons you're seeing power gets restored so quickly is many of our power lines and much of our infrastructure has been made more resilient over the years. And they actually, the Florida legislature put in place a $1 billion resiliency fund. So we are taking measures to deal with the impact of these storms. And to say that we're doing nothing because of politics is just inaccurate.
All right, let's move on from the political nature on that. But I want to get
That's great. Thank you.
I had to do it, just part of my job, and I know you understand that. But I'm curious how you felt watching so many of these rescues play out. First responders getting rescued as well, but also National Guardsmen, a number of these first responders going into these massively flooded areas up to their neck, maybe even over their head, rescuing so many people from their homes. It's watching these rescues play out, especially on live TV, was inspiring to me, and I want to know how you felt about the whole thing.
One of the things that I like to remind folks is all these National Guardsmen and women, over 5,000, they all have families too, and they couldn't be there with their families to help them evacuate or board up their homes or deal with the storm. Once again, their families had to do without their loved one. 1,200 of those National Guardsmen just came home from an overseas deployment. They barely got to hug their families before they were out there again. So we just can't thank them enough. I will bring up another controversial topic, however. 1,000 of those National Guardsmen and women are facing discharge from the military because they didn't take, they have concerns over the vaccine, or they put in for religious exemptions. In fact, one of the Coast Guardsmen who bravely rescued a number of people risking injury and electrocution, strapped a woman in her wheelchair to him, was called by President Biden a hero, is also facing discharge. Look, the vaccine has been shown to not stop the spread. The Floridians that they're saving, I don't think they cared. The CDC is giving new guidelines. Look, the president said the pandemic is over. I think we need to truly rethink this policy before we kick out all of these people in the middle of a recruiting crisis and deny them their pay and benefits that they rightly deserve.
If someone is, and I know that this is something that you'll be discussing this week, but if someone is having significant, their home is significantly damaged, whether it's flooded or what have you, what tips would you give them in A, trying to get that individual assistance from FEMA, and B, making an insurance claim in a state that where the insurance market is really in peril?
So document everything, take photos of everything you can. Hopefully people had done that in the run up to the storm if they sustained serious damage and their belongings were scattered. But document, and get those claims in as soon as possible. There will be, and they're available online. Call my congressional office if you need help finding those resources. But we are pushing hard to get all of those entities into one place, so you don't have to try to move around and find the different agencies. In my area, they'll be in Daytona near the Ocean Center. And that's where you'll be able to find those resources, and we'll have staff there as well. And our phone lines are fully manned and always open.
Now, obviously, a lot of this focuses on Hurricane Ian, but Puerto Rico also continuing to have issues with mostly the power grid, but really Hurricane Fiona dropped a lot of rain on the island, and so they're concerned that they will be left behind in the federal response and the federal aid due to Hurricane Ian. Is that something that you're focused on?
It is, and I'm glad that the President Biden went down there to go see it firsthand. He's coming to Florida as well, and I think it's just important to see the magnitude of the destruction, but also the infrastructure that will need all types of resources, state, local, and federal, to be rebuilt. So they'll certainly be top of mind for the Florida delegation for our fellow citizens over in Puerto Rico.
While I have you here, I do want to ask you about Ukraine. We've seen Ukraine making some headway against Russia and reclaiming more ground. Do you think they're on their way to winning this war against Russia?
Well, they've certainly made positive gains. They've shifted the momentum. I think it's a story as much about how flawed the Russian military is, the corruption in the Russian military, the war that's becoming increasingly unpopular for Putin, their massive deficiencies in logistics and their industrial base, as much as it is our helping the Ukrainians. But I think the biggest thing that could help Ukraine is actually U.S. domestic energy policy. If we would unleash U.S. oil and gas, it would drive the price of oil down around the world. That would not only help Americans at the gas pump, but would starve Putin of his war machine. Every time that he has invaded his neighbors in 2008 in Georgia, in 2014 in Ukraine, the price of oil has been over $100 a barrel. He's doing it because he can afford to do it, and we need to starve him of that oil and gas. And that's by unleashing American energy. And we're going to continue to push and pressure the Biden administration to do that.
Now, if things get bleak for him, he is unpredictable, obviously. What concerns do you have moving forward as Ukraine continues to make this headway?
So from the briefings that I've seen, number one, we need to understand that using tactical or nuclear weapons is a part of Russian doctrine going back to the Soviet days in the Cold War. They call it to escalate, to then de-escalate. That is obviously incredibly dangerous. I think we need to send very clear red lines that any use of WMD, it could also be a radiation leak from Europe's largest nuclear reactor that's right now in the fighting. It could be some kind of chemical weapons. But as he gets more desperate, I do think it is more likely he takes that drastic measure. The big red lines I'm seeing is if the Ukrainians begin advancing beyond the line in 2014 from the original invasion or into Crimea. From the briefings I've received, those are real red lines for Putin. This is existential for him and for his rule. And if he gets us back to the wall, I think he's an incredibly dangerous figure.